He never spoke his own name. He never wrote a single word. He never said mama or papa. At 70 years old, Ray Whittaker walks among us as a silent presence, a figure who seems more like a rural myth than a concrete human being. Yet he exists. He howls when you look him directly in the eyes. He growls when someone blocks his path. And when he smiles, he does so as if he hadn't learned the gesture, as if he were imitating it from a deep corner of his mind where the word never germinated. Ray does not speak, but he is not silent. His world has a different language, one that cannot be spoken, not taught, not easily translated. It is the language of blood, of the body, of repetition. It is the consequence of a family history that never branched out, that folded in on itself so much until it formed a closed, perfect, and cursed circle. I am Burgo, and this is Mexico Prohibido. If you are here, it is because you want to understand beyond the obvious. Because you know that behind every broken life, there is a system that allowed it, a context that sustained it, and a silence that hid it. Subscribe to the channel, because today we are delving into a story you will never forget. Ray was born in Odd, a small isolated village in the mountains of West Virginia. Odd means strange, unusual, a cruelly fitting name for the place where it all began. There are no hospitals, no specialists, no support networks there. Only dirt roads, dilapidated houses, and families who have lived for generations without leaving that invisible perimeter. The Whittaker family was one of them. And they were different from the start. While other family trees grow with various branches, theirs closed in like a snake biting its tail. His father, John Emery Whittaker, and his mother, Gracie Irene Whittaker, were first cousins. It was no accident and no broken taboo. In their family, marriage between cousins was almost the norm. But that wasn't the most extreme. John's and Gracie's parents, meaning Ray's grandparents, were identical twin brothers. Henry and John Whittaker shared not only the surname, but practically the same DNA. And as if that weren't enough, Gracie's mother was also a cousin of her husband. Thus each layer of the tree reinforced the same genetic code, over and over again, as if someone had blocked the possibility of variation. On a genetic level, this has a name: autosomal recessive expression. Traits that usually lie deep in the DNA, neurological problems, deformities, mutations, are activated when both parents transmit the same defective copy. And when this repeats over generations, the result is not only predictable, but inevitable. Ray was one of those results. But it's not just that. It's not a medical statistic. It's a complex, unpredictable, fragmented human being. It's the broken mirror of a legacy no one chose. As a child, Ray received no diagnosis, nor was he taken to a doctor, no therapy, no psychological evaluation. It was simply how he was. He moved abruptly. He did not speak. He did not respond to his name. Sometimes he threw objects. Sometimes he remained completely motionless, staring at a fixed point for hours. His family did not hide him, but they also did not understand him. They didn't know what to do with him, and in Odd, there was no one to ask. The local school politely declined him, leaving a handwritten note. "We do not have the resources to care for him." So Ray grew up in his house, in his family, within himself. He never learned to read or write. He recognized neither numbers nor colors, but he reacted to the sound of pots in the kitchen. He knew when there was food. He knew who his older sister was, although he never said her name. He liked to touch things multiple times, as if the world only made sense if his hands could confirm it. He would pick up a cup, place it on the table, pick it up again, turn it, leave it, and he would repeat it. Not compulsively, but like someone trying to understand something essential that eluded him. The doctors who saw him decades later, because Ray only entered a clinic when he was over 60 years old, suspected severe nonverbal autism, level 3, the highest spectrum. But it was too late to intervene. His mind had formed in an environment without language, without stimulation, without windows to the outside world. It was as if his brain had decided to develop in its own direction, like a river carving its path without a map. Despite everything, Ray was never violent without reason. If he growled or pushed someone, he did it to draw a line. If he retreated to a corner and covered his ears, it was because the world was unbearable for him. He did not scream out of anger. He screamed because he had no other way to say, "Stop." He did not imitate emotions. He lived them. When he laughed, he truly did. When he was scared, he crouched as if he wanted to disappear. No one taught him this. He learned it solely through instinct. For decades, his body remained functional, albeit limited. He walked with small steps. Sometimes he limped. His posture was slightly bent. He ate with his hands. He urinated where he stood when he urgently needed to. Not out of provocation, but because his body did not obey social norms, but physiological necessities. And yet he survived, day after day, year after year, as if his mere existence were a form of resistance. Once, a new neighbor tried to approach him. He offered him an apple. Ray looked at him, growled softly, and took a step back. But he didn't leave. He stayed and watched. The next day, the neighbor returned. This time he brought a rubber ball. He placed it on the ground and walked away. Ray approached slowly, nudged it with his foot, watched it spin, and smiled. He said nothing. He didn't run to hug him, but in his silent language that was a thank you. That was one of the few times someone outside his family could make contact. No friendship, no conventional bond, just a simple, pure interaction, without expectations. Ray could not act. Everything about him was authentic, raw, direct, and perhaps that is what hurts the most. To realize that in this man, whom many called an animal, there was more emotional honesty than in much of the world that watched him uncomprehendingly. In the next part, we will delve into the heart of this family who cared for him or isolated him for decades. We will see what it is like to live with someone like Ray, what boundaries they crossed, what decisions they made, and what secrets they still keep. The house where Ray Whittaker spent his entire life has no number, no plaque, no doorbell. It is about 20 minutes from the nearest paved road, accessible by a dirt track that disappears among twisted trees and dense undergrowth. The porch leans to the side, as if bearing the weight of decades of time and secrets. The windows are covered with faded curtains. Outside there is a broken chair, 2 rusty buckets, and an old dog that barely moves. This house was not built to receive visitors. It was built to enclose what the world did not want to see. At least 7 members of the Whittaker family lived there for over 50 years. Brothers, cousins, uncles, but all with the same blood, literally. None of them finished school. Some could read halfway, others not at all. There was no television in the living room until well into the 1990s. The only telephone was a rotary dial phone, and almost never worked. But what impressed most was not the poverty, but the way they organized around Ray, as if his existence dictated the rules, as if everyone had a specific role: to calm him, feed him, dress him, keep him away from dangers. His older sister, Mary Lou, was his primary caregiver for decades. She slept in a single bed next to his. She cut his nails, brushed his teeth as best she could, prepared his favorite foods, almost always porridge, purees, or old bread soaked in milk, because Ray could not chew well. If he was agitated, she spoke softly to him, even though he did not answer. If he wet himself, she bathed him silently. It was as if she were caring for a giant, unpredictable, and often uncontrollable child. Yet she never complained, or at least not in front of him. One day, a county social worker tried to visit the house. He had received an anonymous report of possible neglect. When he arrived, Ray was sitting on the porch, hunched, chewing on a piece of wood. He did not move. He did not react. But when the man took a step towards him, Ray growled, a deep, guttural growl that brought the visitor to an abrupt halt. From inside, Mary Lou emerged with her hair up and flour on her hands. She said she didn't need anything, that they were fine, that Ray didn't bother anyone. The social worker jotted down a few things, left, and never returned. This encounter perfectly summarized the paradox of the Whittaker family. They lived on the fringes of the system, but did not want to be part of it. They did not seek help, but also accepted no interference. Ray was not a victim to them. He was part of the house, like the floorboards or the persistent smell of dampness. They did not see him as sick, but simply as Ray. When he had tantrums, they surrounded him without touching him. When he cried for no reason, they sat near him and waited. They had learned that neither punishments nor rewards worked with him. His world had a different rhythm, a different logic. Once, when Ray was about 40 years old, he ran away. It was the middle of the night. The back door was slightly ajar. Mary Lou had fallen asleep. When she woke up, she noticed he wasn't in his bed and called his name, even though she knew he wouldn't answer. Everyone went looking for him, with lanterns, with fear, with guilt. They found him 6 hours later, sitting in a stream, completely naked, holding a frog in his hands. He was not lost. He was not crying. He was just looking into the water, as if hearing something no one else could hear. He said nothing when they covered him with a blanket, but once home, he allowed himself to be bathed without resistance, as if he understood that this momentary freedom had a price: the return to captivity. This episode marked a turning point. Since then, the doors were reinforced. A chain was put on his door. Not for punishment, they said, but for protection, because no one outside would understand him, because someone could harm him. But deep down, they knew they also feared the opposite. That he would unknowingly cause harm, and that this would bring the authorities. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Ray was a risk they loved, a risk they would never give up. Over the years, the first rumors began to reach Odd. Someone, an amateur photographer, a curious person with a YouTube channel, had heard about the Howling Man and wanted to see him. They came without permission, with hidden cameras, under the pretext of delivering food or asking for directions. Some took photos from a distance, others, bolder, tried to film him. The family began to turn away any unknown vehicle. Once, Ray saw a lens peeking through the fence and threw a stone. He did not miss. That's when a distant relative, one of the few who had left Odd, decided to intervene. His name was Daniel, and he had studied biology at a community college. He did not live with the Whittakers, but visited them occasionally. He decided that if the world was going to see Ray, then it should at least do so with respect. He contacted an independent documentary filmmaker, and together they recorded the first formal images of Ray, with Mary Lou's consent. There was no script, no interviews, no sad music. Just images. Ray walking in the garden, Ray chewing on a rope, Ray watching a fly sit on his knee for 3 minutes without moving. The video went viral. No one expected it. Suddenly thousands of people were commenting, some with compassion, others with sensationalism, others with disgust. Debates erupted about genetics, mental health, ethics. Questions were raised about whether the family was exploiting him, whether they were making money from his image, whether Ray understood what was happening. The answer was clear. No. Ray didn't know what the internet was. He didn't know millions were watching him. He didn't know people were debating his humanity from sofas in cities he would never visit. At home, everything remained the same. The kitchen with the rusted stove, the bathroom without hot water, the unreliable battery-powered radio. But now packages with donations arrived. Clothes, food, medicine. Once, even a wheelchair that no one had ordered. The family was grateful, but also felt harassed. Ray showed no interest in any of it, not even in the educational toys that were sent to him. He only paid attention to a blanket with tree drawings. He dragged it around for days. Then he placed it on a chair and didn't touch it again. What no one knew. Neither the donors, nor the critics, nor even the documentary filmmaker, was that his physical condition was beginning to deteriorate. Slowly, but steadily. He walked slower, breathed with more effort. Sometimes he fell for no reason. And the most unsettling, there were days when he made no sound, no growl, no whimper, nothing. As if his body was shutting down from within. In the next part, we will learn about Ray's true state of health, what the doctors found when he was thoroughly examined for the first time in his life, and how he and his family reacted when confronted with a truth that everyone had avoided for years. Do you want to know what really happened to Ray Whittaker? The day Ray was taken to the hospital for the first time was also the quietest his family remembered. No one said it, but everyone knew something was wrong. Ray was no longer walking as before. He dragged his right foot as if carrying an invisible weight. His breathing had become noisy. He slept more than usual, and when he was awake, he remained motionless for hours, staring at the ceiling. He didn't growl. He didn't gesticulate. He didn't defend himself. It was as if he was leaving silently. It was Mary Lou who made the decision. After weeks of seeing her brother weaken without explanation, she called Daniel, the distant cousin who years earlier had tried to publish the story respectfully. She asked him for help. Not to film, not to tell, just to take Ray to the nearest hospital. The drive was long. 2 hours in the pickup truck. Ray did not resist. He did not react. He allowed himself to be buckled in without making a sound. He wore a gray shirt that was once white and cotton pants with earth stains. His hands were, as always, clenched into fists. When they arrived at the emergency room, the stares began. Nurses, patients, cleaning staff. Everyone stopped to look at the man with wide-open eyes who said not a word. Daniel tried to explain. He's 70 years old. He's never received medical care. He needs a full examination. The medical staff was skeptical. Never? Not once. Daniel nodded. Never. First, a physical examination. The doctor, a man of about 40 with a restrained expression, knelt before Ray and asked permission to touch his leg. Ray looked at him without blinking. He didn't move. The doctor cautiously began to palpate his right knee. As soon as he pressed a certain point, Ray let out a deep guttural whimper, almost a restrained roar. It was pain. A pain that had been ignored for years. The X-rays showed severe osteoarthritis, with virtually no cartilage left and loose bone fragments rubbing against each other. The doctor expressed it in technical terms, but the conclusion was clear. Ray had been walking for years with a joint that would have been operated on decades earlier in any other patient. He must have been in constant pain. The doctor murmured, more to himself than to the others. But it wasn't just the knee. The medical report contained a long list of findings. Chronic malnutrition, partial muscle atrophy, spinal wear, ingrown toenails, mild kidney problems, and an untreated dental infection that probably caused him pain when chewing. When they asked Mary Lou if she had ever taken him to a dentist, she lowered her gaze. He didn't like going out, she said, but everyone knew it wasn't just that. It was also the shame, the fear, the constant feeling that Ray would not be understood or treated with dignity. During the neurological examination, the hospital's psychiatrist tried to communicate with him. She showed him cards with colors, objects, faces. Ray did not react. Then she offered him a small red rubber ball. He took it, squeezed it several times, let it go, picked it up again. He rotated it between his fingers for almost a minute and then threw it weakly to the floor. The psychiatrist wrote something in her notebook. She didn't say it aloud, but it became clear that she suspected an autism spectrum disorder of its most severe degree. When she mentioned nonverbal autism level 3, Mary Lou asked what that meant. The psychiatrist smiled cautiously. It means that your brother has a form of autism that affects all areas of his life. He cannot speak, cannot understand complex structures, and needs constant help. Mary Lou nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just said, "We already knew that." The hospital wanted to keep Ray for observation. They suggested further tests, a tomography, genetic analyses, even a longer psychiatric evaluation. But Mary Lou refused, not aggressively, but with a firm sadness. Ray won't understand. He's not used to being alone. He won't endure it here. The medical team insisted. They said it could help, that there might be treatments to relieve his pain, improve his quality of life. But Mary Lou had already made a decision. Ray would return home that same night. Daniel tried to mediate. He asked her to at least accept a monthly consultation. He suggested a doctor's home visit. He even offered to pay for the medication with the donations received since the video was published. But the hospital made it clear that without proper follow-up, they could not guarantee improvements. Ray needed more than a pill. He needed rehabilitation, structure, stability. And above all, a support network that his family alone could no longer provide. That night, on the way back to Odd, the silence in the delivery van was so thick it hurt. Ray had fallen asleep, his head tilted to his shoulder. Mary Lou covered him with an old blanket. Daniel drove with tense hands on the steering wheel. He knew he had done the right thing by taking him to the hospital, but he also knew that nothing had changed. Ray would remain Ray, in his house, in his world. The following days were complicated. Ray seemed more restless, perhaps because of the trip, perhaps because of the pain, perhaps because of something no one could see. He began to refuse food. He spit out food. He pushed plates away. Once he threw a pot on the floor and watched the contents spill. Mary Lou tried to calm him, but the usual methods no longer worked. Daniel visited the house again, this time with a volunteer physical therapist. Ray wouldn't let himself be touched. He slammed his palm against the wall and made a sound no one had heard from him before. A deep, long whimper, almost a roar, as if his body was trying to express something it didn't know how to formulate. The physical therapist left after 20 minutes. "I can't work like this," he said, "not without a team. Not without a suitable environment." Mary Lou closed the door again, carefully, without resentment, like someone who knows that external help always comes too late or is wrong. That night, Ray locked himself in his room and refused to come out. He hit the walls with his knuckles. He murmured soft, unrecognizable sounds. He ripped off his shirt. When Mary Lou tried to enter, he looked at her with wide-open eyes, as if he didn't recognize her. But he didn't hurt her. He just fell onto the mattress, to the side, as if his body was finally admitting that it couldn't go on. In the next part, we will learn what happens in the following months, how Ray's deterioration affects the whole family, what extreme decisions they begin to make, and what unexpected gesture will change everything. Are you ready to see how far love can go when language no longer exists? The following weeks were a slow descent, at first barely noticeable, but then unstoppable. Ray no longer went out to the porch. He no longer touched his favorite objects. He no longer dragged his blanket with the trees around the house, nor did he try to follow Mary Lou into the kitchen as he used to. He stayed in his room, lying on his side, eyes open. He wasn't fully asleep, but he also didn't seem fully awake. He remained silent, even when the dogs barked outside or the rain beat heavily on the tin roof. His silence, which used to be his natural form of existence, now became denser, more absent. It was no longer the silence of one who does not speak. It was that of one who is no longer there. Mary Lou began to break down in silence. When the others slept, she stayed in the kitchen, her hands on the table, without moving. She did not cry violently, but it showed in her bent back, in her shoulders that no longer carried just a brother's body, but the burden of a story she didn't know how to end. Several times she tried to contact the hospital again, but when dialing, she hung up before they answered. She didn't know what to ask for. She didn't know how to explain that what they needed didn't fit into a prescription or a medical consultation. One night, Ray did something he hadn't done since childhood. He got up in the middle of the night, left his room, went to the kitchen, and sat on the floor. He said nothing. He made no sound. He just sat there, staring at a crack in the wall. When Mary Lou found him, she knelt beside him, spoke softly to him, offered him some warm milk. He did not react. Then, without much thought, she sat down next to him, leaned against the same wall, and remained there in silence. They stayed like that until dawn. The next morning, Ray vomited. A thick yellowish liquid with an acidic smell. It was the first clear physical sign that something inside him was failing. Daniel was called urgently. He arrived in less than an hour. This time he didn't ask if they should take him to the hospital. He simply carried him in his arms. He was lighter than he remembered, and he lifted him onto the pickup truck. Mary Lou followed without protesting. There was no more room for moral decisions. Ray was sick, and this time his body was no longer resisting alone. The rural hospital received him with a different attitude. There were doctors who already knew the case, nurses who had read about him. This time there were no judgmental glances, only urgency. They took blood samples. They hooked him up to an IV. They discovered an advanced infection in his digestive tract, probably a bacterium that had remained latent for years and had now spread. The doctor spoke softly to Daniel, as if not wanting Mary Lou to hear him. If you hadn't brought him today, he wouldn't have survived this week. Ray was admitted to the hospital for the first time in his life. A white bed, a room smelling of disinfectant, a monitor that beeped with every heartbeat. He didn't try to remove the cables. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. He seemed to surrender, as if he knew his body had to stop. In the first few days, he barely ate. He didn't react to stimuli, but on the fourth day, in the afternoon, a nurse placed a blanket with drawings on it. Not of trees, but of colorful fish, and she placed her hand on it. He touched it. He crumpled it between his fingers. Then, for the first time in weeks, a sound escaped him. A deep, dark murmur, like an echo of himself. This small gesture was interpreted by the medical team as a sign of consciousness. They decided to begin gentle, physical therapy. They tried to get him to move his arms, to sit up, to recognize objects. In some exercises, he reacted. In others, he simply closed his eyes. There was no clear pattern, but everyone agreed on one thing. He was there, not as before, not with the same energy. But his presence had not completely vanished. Meanwhile, Daniel took care of all the legal matters. He ensured that Ray was officially registered in the state health system. He applied for aid for severely disabled people. He initiated steps for Ray to receive a basic pension. Mary Lou resisted at first. She said Ray needed nothing but his home, his family, his routine. But then, seeing him so weak, she accepted that something had to change. The hospital suggested an alternative. They should move him to a hospice, where he could receive constant medical care without completely losing his family environment. There was a place, 2 hours from Odd, in the middle of the mountains, where cases like his were accepted. Private rooms, trained staff, occupational therapy, unlimited visits. It seemed ideal, but the move meant a difficult decision: to take Ray out of the house where he had lived for 70 years. Mary Lou spent entire days thinking about it. She walked on the porch, in the garden, in the kitchen. She went into Ray's room, watched him sleep, and then left without a word. Finally, one afternoon, she asked Daniel directly, "Do you think he would be better there than here?" Daniel did not answer with words. He only looked at her with eyes full of restrained compassion, and that was enough. The night before the move, Mary Lou prepared Ray's favorite meal, cornbread with warm milk. She served it to him in the same bowl as always. He looked at it, touched it, and then pushed it to the center of the table. Then he stretched out his hand to her. A simple gesture, subtle. But with Ray, that was a statement, not of love, not of farewell, but of understanding. The next day, the journey passed, in silence. Ray lay on a stretcher, covered with the fish blanket. Mary Lou sat beside him. Daniel drove. There were no tears. There were no words. Only the sound of the engine and the occasional crunch of the wheels on the gravel. When they reached the center, they were greeted by a young nurse with a gentle voice and a firm gaze. She called Ray by his name. She knelt down to his level. She showed him a shiny object, a small mirror. Ray looked at it, then looked at the nurse, and for a second, his expression changed. It wasn't a smile. It was something more subtle, a slight relaxation of the face, as if he was finally accepting that he was where he needed to be. In the next and final part, we will learn how Ray copes with this new phase, what unexpected signs he begins to give, and what question, as human as it is inevitable, will still resonate after the end. Who was Ray Whittaker, really? The center where Ray was admitted was not like a hospital. There were trees all around. Birds sang at all hours of the day, and there was a silence that was not clinical, but natural. The rooms were simple, with large windows that let in the morning light. The beds faced the open fields, not sterile corridors. Ray was placed in one of the quietest rooms, overlooking a solitary oak tree. There, under the roof of a place he did not know, the final chapter of his life began. The first days were for observation. The center's staff took turns trying to understand his language. When he growled, when he huddled, when his gaze lingered too long on something. He was treated like a child coming from another country without knowing the language. They didn't expect him to speak. They expected to understand him through his gestures, his rhythm, his breathing. One of the most significant moments occurred a week after his arrival. An occupational therapist named Clara brought a box with objects of different textures, fabrics, woods, sponges, smooth stones. She placed them before Ray without pushing him. He looked at the box for a long time. Then, as if he knew exactly what he wanted, he took a piece of braided rope and began to wrap it around his hand. Once, twice, 3 times, he raised it to his face. He smelled it. And then, without looking at anyone, he began to rub it against his cheek. It was not a mechanical gesture. It was delicate, deliberate. Clara watched without intervening. She noted in her notebook, seeks contact through the object, recognizes familiar texture. Soothing gesture. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a simple, repetitive movement, but for those who looked with different eyes, it was a way of saying, "This gives me peace." Gradually, Ray began to develop routines. He woke up at the same time. He sat by the window every morning. He touched the window frame with his knuckles. Then he dragged his blanket into the corner and lay on it. He wouldn't eat if the order of the meals was changed. He wouldn't let himself be dressed if Mary Lou wasn't present. His world was still narrow, but now it had new contours. Mary Lou drove every other day to visit him. At first she did so with fear. She feared that Ray wouldn't recognize her, but he always reacted when she came. He turned his head, made a low sound, a barely audible growl, and looked at her intently. He didn't hug her, he didn't smile, but he took her hand firmly. It was his way of saying, "I'm here." Daniel also visited him, though less frequently. He preferred to observe from a distance, coordinating with the staff, ensuring nothing was missing. Sometimes he felt out of place, as if Ray's story, as much as it pained him, didn't entirely belong to him. And perhaps he was right. Because Ray, in his silence, had created his own universe, shut off from the sounds of the outside world, but full of subtle signs that few could read. Once, a volunteer brought an old radio and tuned it to a local bluegrass music station. When the first chords played, Ray turned his head. He closed his eyes. And for the first time, he moved his foot to the rhythm of the melody. It wasn't a dance, it was a recognition, as if in those notes there was something his memory understood, even if he didn't know what it was. The nurse noticed the detail. Since then, they put the radio in his room at the same time every afternoon. The improvement was not miraculous. There was no complete recovery. Ray didn't start speaking. He didn't walk steadily. He didn't learn to write his name. But that wasn't what was expected either. What surprised the team was something else. His adaptability. His way of finding small islands of calm in a world that was never made for him. His way of reacting, even with a minimal gesture, to those who showed him respect. Over the months, the view of others also changed. Many of the staff who initially viewed him as a clinical case began to speak of him as a presence. Ray doesn't have to speak for us to hear him, a therapist said in a team meeting. Ray has his language. We just have to learn it. In autumn, as the trees outside turned yellow and red, Ray spent more time at the window. He watched the leaves fall. Sometimes he reached out his hand, as if to catch them. Sometimes he remained motionless for hours, his eyes fixed on a specific branch. No one knew what he saw, but it was obvious that it calmed him. Mary Lou, for her part, began to keep a diary, not for herself, but for him. Every day she wrote down what he had done, what he had eaten, how she had seen him. She placed it on the table in his room, along with a wildflower or a stone from the garden. I don't know if he can read this, she said. But I want him to know that I see him, think of him, accompany him every day. And then, one winter day, something unexpected happened. Ray fell asleep after lunch, as always, on his blanket, head tilted to the left side. But this time he didn't move all afternoon. The nurse tried to wake him as usual. He didn't react. The doctor was called. His vital signs were checked. Everything seemed normal, yet something in his body had shut down. It wasn't a physical collapse. It was something more subtle, as if Ray, after so many years of silent struggle, had decided to rest deeply. He was kept under observation overnight. Mary Lou was called immediately. She arrived before dawn. She entered the room. She sat beside his bed. She took his hand and waited. Ray didn't open his eyes, but when she stroked his forehead, his breathing accelerated slightly. It was his way of saying, "I hear you." That was the last sign. Ray Whittaker passed away at dawn, his hands intertwined with his sister's, painlessly, silently, without a last word, because he had never had one, yet with a presence so strong, so obvious, that everyone around him knew that something sacred had left with him. The news was not published in any media. There were no headlines, no mass funerals. But in that small community in West Virginia, and in the hearts of those who learned to hear Ray's language, a lesson remained that cannot be erased. For Ray was not just the result of a complex family history. He was a living testament to what it means to exist when the world doesn't understand you, but you insist on being there. He was proof that love can be built without words, that dignity does not depend on language, and that every life, even the most invisible, has invaluable worth. If this story has touched you, moved you, or simply made you reflect on the meaning of silence, subscribe to the channel. Here we share stories that others preferred to forget, because we believe that the forbidden is not always dangerous. Sometimes it is simply human. And if you wish to honor Ray's memory, comment below with a single word: present. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next story.